I don't know about you, but I have always absolutely loved cryptids. And for the longest time as a child, I just did not understand why more people were not curious about the possibility that many cryptids could actually be real. Anytime as a child that I would bring up the topic of Bigfoot, I would be met with rolling eyes, people with sarcastic laughs, and most of the time these were adults. And for the most part, essentially, they were just brushing off my wild imagination in exchange for more serious topics, which I kind of understand, but at the same time, I always wondered why their minds were just not open to more possibilities. My imagination, though, never strayed too far. As I got older, my curiosity about cryptids just kept growing. There might be an actual possibility that a few of these stories might actually be very real. One of the things that really kind of pushed me towards believing that some of these creatures, although not all of them, some of them do sound quite outlandish, but there are a lot of firsthand witnesses and stories coming forward that make you think twice about the possibilities. And I always believe that where there is smoke, there is usually fire. And to be fair, a lot of the animals that we once thought were cryptids, for example, the narwhal, everyone once believed that the possibility of a whale with a unicorn horn on its head was absolutely impossible, that this thing just did not exist. But eventually we ended up finding out that narwhals were very much a real animal. So that just brings me to my question as to whether or not there are cryptids out there that could very much be real. So in today's video, I want to take the time to talk about 5 mysterious cryptids that aren't Bigfoot and that could very well be real. All right, so let's get into today's video. Hey guys, now welcome back to my channel. My name is Ashley and I like to talk about crime, creepy, and unbelievable stories. So if that's your thing, please consider comment, liking, subscribing, or even check out my TikTok for more short story content. I do post on there a lot more often. If you guys are interested in all of that, the links are down below in my description box. And with that, let's get into the story. All right, so first up today, we're going to talk about the Mongolian Deathworm. Now, this one's a bit controversial. Some people either believe that this is complete fiction, while others believe that this is very much a real creature that we just have not discovered yet. So starting off strong, we go to the Gobi Desert that is located between northern China and southern Mongolia. With over 500,000 square miles of land, it's hard to not believe that there are undiscovered species possibly roaming the desert. The story of this mysterious creature have been passed on for hundreds and hundreds of years and have even been included in movies. And most recently, there was a giant version of the Mongolian Deathworm in the revamped movie of Dune. Let me know if you guys saw that movie. But of course, for those of you who don't know what a Mongolian Deathworm is, let's go into that a little bit more. Well, according to history, these stories have been passed down from generation to generation. And the Mongolian Deathworm is said to look similar to a sandworm with a long sausage-shaped body reaching up to 5 feet in length. It's also said to be a dark red, and you can always tell which side is the mouth because that's where the larger end of the worm is, with the tail usually tapering off into a cone shape. But the most terrifying part of the Mongolian Deathworm is always said to be its mouth, that's said to be filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. carrying a bite that you just simply do not want to be on the opposite end of. It's also believed to be extremely venomous and that it could easily take down a human being with minimal effort. But the legend goes that the reason we don't see these worms out in the surface of the desert is because they're actually believed to live beneath the sand of the Gobi Desert, only surfacing during June and July. However, if one is nearby, you will definitely know that it's in the area because of the waves that form on the sand as it's making its way underneath. So the origin story of the Mongolian deathworm goes back generations, like I was saying earlier, with Mongolia's nomadic tribes calling it the Ogopogo, and I apologize for my mispronunciation there. It was not an easy word to say. Essentially, this ends up translating into intestine worm when you translate it into English because of the resemblance of how it looks to the intestine of a cow. Unlike Bigfoot or other cryptids, the Mongolian deathworm has never been photographed, but that hasn't stopped cryptozoologists and people alike from searching for it. One of these believers was a Czech cryptozoologist named Ivan Makarel, who truly believed that the deathworm was real. He was so convinced of the existence that he traveled to Mongolia in search for it in 1990, in 1992, and again in 2004. Ivan first heard of the deathworm from a Russian paleontologist when he was just a child. The stories absolutely fascinated him. And eventually, as Ivan got older and was in school, he met another student that happened to be Mongolian. Curious about whether or not this student knew about the Mongolian deathworm, one day he kind of just asked him about it, and to his surprise, the kid laughed it off but also entertained the idea. He ended up replying to him, "I know it, it is a very strange creature." After that, it was essentially a done deal for Ivan. This somehow solidified the idea that the Mongolian deathworm was real, and he decided to dedicate his life to finding it. Although he never did discover the Mongolian deathworm, he does remain hopeful that it's out there somewhere. But this brings us to my question: could it possibly be real or not? Well, skeptics will tell you absolutely no, this is just a make-believe story. Most skeptics will tell you that the Mongolian deathworm is simply being mistaken for another animal that kind of looks like it, and a few of these examples are a snake or a worm lizard that is also known to burrow underground. But because there hasn't been any sort of video footage, no photos, and the first-hand stories are pretty vague and sometimes can be chalked up to just misidentifying an existing animal, it's very hard to convince a lot of people that the Mongolian deathworm could actually be real. But let me know what you guys think. Next up is a cryptid that hardly needs an introduction, and it's El Chupacabra. And if you lived in Latin America or anywhere in the Caribbean, you've definitely seen what people think the Chupacabra looks like. So if you don't know, El Chupacabra is a legendary cryptid with its origin story coming out of Puerto Rico. Its name quite literally translates into goat sucker from Spanish, and it's because of how it leaves its prey when it's finished with it. It's often described as being a very small creature, sometimes resembling a rabid dog, or some people even say that it looks like some sort of lizard creature with hair covering its entire body. From global reports, the Chupacabra preys on goats or any sort of farm animal really by sucking their bodies dry of blood. Although first reports of this creature started coming out of Puerto Rico in the 1970s, there were whispers of something called El Vampiro de Moca, which means the vampire of Moca, a small town in Puerto Rico. And the story goes that dozens and dozens of farm animals were found with puncture wounds, and all of their blood from their bodies had been sucked dry. The incident just went on to make more headlines, and essentially everyone in town was freaking out about what sort of animal could possibly do this. Because if you don't know, there's absolutely no animal out there that is known to suck the blood out of its prey completely. It wasn't until the 1990s, again in Puerto Rico, that it went completely viral. In 1994, there were 4 to 6 little gray creatures found under a bed that could not be identified. The owner of the home was obviously mortified about this discovery and ended up chasing them out of the house with a broom and never saw them again. The following year, in the summer of 1995, over 150 livestock animals were found deceased in Puerto Rico, all suffering from the exact same thing. Their blood had been sucked right out of them. In November of the same year, dozens more turkeys, rabbits, goats, cats, dogs, and even horses had all been found in the same condition. And this time it was in the small town of Caguas in Puerto Rico. It was becoming a daily occurrence on the island, according to two documentary makers who were there during the mass hysteria. And they went on to say that the entire island was essentially talking about the Chupacabra non-stop. It was all over the news, it was on the radio, it was on people's TVs. Essentially, that's all everyone was talking about. And it was creating quite a lot of fear. Since there are a lot of farmers in these Caribbean islands, a lot of their livelihoods do depend on the byproducts that their animals can produce. And with so many of their animals just mysteriously passing away, people were freaking out. Then there was the story of a witness who said she saw the creature inside of her home. As they were sleeping, they said that they left their window open in the middle of the night to let in the cool breeze since it was quite hot. However, this proved to be a huge mistake. Suddenly, a very small creature made their way into the room and essentially tore up the entire bedroom, leaving behind what could only be described as slime and a piece of meat hanging from the windsill. Witnesses described it as being quite hairy, having huge red eyes, but that's all they were really able to see before the creature disappeared into the darkness. These mind-boggling attacks just continued across Puerto Rico, with more and more witnesses coming forward describing it in a very similar manner. It always had oversized red eyes and a hairy body. Some people would say that it even resembled an alien, while others said it looked like it came from the monkey family. But whatever it was, everyone was absolutely terrified of it. Then came a shocker. Witnesses started coming forward, claiming that this creature was also capable of walking on two legs, similar to a human. And whenever it did this, it was said to have measured over 4 feet tall. This then continued to push the narrative that whatever this creature was likely to come from the primate species. So obviously it led to people asking, well, what could this creature possibly be? Well, the theories go from reasonable to the unbelievable. Skeptics will just tell you that this is probably some sort of rabid animal, likely a coyote who is suffering from mange, a skin disease that makes animals look patchy with rough skin texture. And if you've ever seen an animal suffering from mange, they rarely resemble what the rest of the normal versions of other animals like them look like. So this theory does hold a lot of credence because a lot of these people are seeing these creatures usually in the middle of the night. So it would be quite easy to confuse a creature that's suffering from a horrible skin disease like mange and confuse it for something that we've never seen before. So it's not completely ridiculous to say that this theory does have some validity to it. However, it does not answer the question as to how all of these animals are having their blood drained from their bodies from a small puncture wound, nor does it explain how this animal is able to stand and even run on its two back legs. Sure, there are reasonable explanations, like dogs, they do have the ability to stand up. Some of them even take a few steps on their back legs, but it's not possible for them to carry on that movement for extended periods of time, let alone run on two legs. A more cryptic theory pushes the idea that the Chupacabra is some sort of alien hybrid between the Greys and an animal that was lost or let go on Earth, while others believe that it was likely some sort of government experiment gone horribly wrong. Let me know what you guys think. So moving on to our next cryptid, and this one is called Goatman. Now I know this sounds a little crazy, but hear me out on this one. I find this one to be quite fascinating. Now, initially, when you hear the word Goatman, my brain, and I'm sure a lot of your brains do the same thing, it goes straight into some sort of fantasy world like Narnia. But the Goatman is a cryptid that I've been looking into a lot more lately, and that's because it might not necessarily be a cryptid at all, but instead some sort of demonic entity or at least some sort of evil entity. So there are two versions of this story, but the one we're going to talk about today takes us to Alton, Texas, whereas the other version occurs in Maryland. So in Alton, Texas, we meet a goat farmer named Oscar Washburn. He was an African American, and this was in 1938, still early from the days of slavery. So as you can imagine, racism was rampant across many states, especially in the South. Oscar, though, was very well known across Alton. He also had a small business where he would sell goat products, and eventually everyone came to know him as the Goatman. As Oscar was becoming more and more successful, more well known across the town, he started putting up these makeshift billboards for himself, including one on a bridge that was known as the Old Alton Bridge. Unfortunately, though, there was a supremacist group living in the area, and they kind of just grew with anger and a lot of resentment because they just did not want to see an African American like Oscar becoming successful and very likely more successful than themselves. The group of white men then drove to Old Alton Bridge, parked, and then followed the signs towards Oscar's home. That's where they ended up breaking into Oscar's home. They kidnapped him, dragged him to the bridge, and unfortunately, that's where they proceeded to throw him over the bridge, over the side of it, while he was hanging from a rope. And unfortunately, that is where Oscar would pass away. After what they deemed was long enough, they decided to pull the rope back up to retrieve Oscar. However, to their surprise, when they looked over the ledge of the bridge, Oscar's body was gone, and there was absolutely no splash heard in the water underneath. There was no sign that the water had been disturbed either. Regardless of what happened there, the men decided that they weren't quite done with Oscar. They didn't really care what happened to his body anyways, so they decided to go back to his family home, and that's where they proceeded to take the lives of Oscar's family as well. Ever since then, people who drive over Old Alton Bridge, which by the way has now been nicknamed as Goatman's Bridge, have reported seeing a very strange apparition of what appears to quite literally look like a goat man looking in the darkness. Others have seen of a man simply herding goats deep within the forest, not really paying attention to them, while others swear they see the ghost staring them down with red eyes. However, the bridge is not the only thing that is reportedly haunted. Locals of Alton swear that there is something absolutely terrifying hiding in the woods. Tales of a maniacal laughter echoing deep within the forest have been heard, while others hear these deep, unnatural growls, something like they've never heard of before, while other people swear on their lives that they've been chased by something that they just could not identify while they were in the forest. Now, while the story of Oscar is the more popular one, there are tales of Satanism taking place within the forest that could potentially have opened a gateway to hell. Many relate the Goatman to the well-known goat head of Baphomet, which today has essentially become synonymous with Satanism and evil. Let me know what you guys think. Is the Goatman a cryptid, or is it more of a demonic entity? Up next is a creature that is probably the one that's most likely to be real, and it's called the orang pendek. So this one might not be Bigfoot, but it's definitely something similar. And like I said, it's probably the cryptid that is more likely to be real. And this story takes us all the way to Sumatra. And there have been stories of this creature circulating since the colonial times about a strange ape-like creature that walks on 2 feet and stands approximately 4 to 5 feet tall. It's also said that this creature has a face much more similar to that of a human rather than an ape, which is essentially why it was given the name orang pendek, which translates to short person. Of course, the skeptics are back and they will tell you that the orang pendek is likely just an orangutan or some sort of similar species related to it. However, there are a few points that have convinced scientists that this is probably not the case. For example, the orang pendek is said to have black or honey-colored hair, and it also appears to have long hair coming from its scalp the same way humans do. While the orangutans are confined to the higher and northern part of the island, the orang pendek has been spotted quite often on the forest floor of the jungle. Now, the first sighting of the orang pendek goes back to 1910 when it was spotted by a local boy. He was working for one of the Dutch colonists at the time, and when he was sent out to the Barrison Mountains, that's where he saw it. He said it was about 15 meters away from him, and it appeared to have more of a human-like appearance than that of a primate. He described it as being very hairy, but being a local, the boy knew that it was not an orangutan. Its facial features also stood out to him because, again, he said that it resembled to be more of a man than a primate. The sightings then continued on for years and years, and then in 1927, apparently, one of these creatures was actually caught in a tiger trap, but the creature was able to break free. Traces of blood were left behind, which were then collected and examined by a zoologist named K.W. Domerman, who concluded that this did not belong to a human, it didn't belong to a gibbon or a bear, although I'm not sure how reliable these blood tests or exams could have been in the 1920s. Following the 20s, the sightings really did dwindle until the 1980s when a researcher named Debbie Martyr arrived. She was a travel writer, and she had heard tales of the orang pendek like many other people had, and at first she was actually quite skeptical. But the more she talked to locals about it and the more stories she heard, she actually became quite convinced that this creature did exist. Then in 1990, she had her very own sighting, which solidified her belief in the orang pendek. She said it was unlike anything she had ever seen before and that it definitely appeared to be much more human than ape. Now, her belief that this creature was very much real and it wasn't an orangutan or any sort of other primate in the area had to do with several factors. She said that it was the way it walked, it was upright, and although it was smaller than apes and humans, it appeared to be built similar to a boxer fighter. It looked to be quite strong just by looking at it. Right away, though, Debbie knew that she was not looking at an orangutan, and that was because of the proportions. They were absolutely nothing alike. And I'll put a picture here of what people say the orang pendek looks like and what an orangutan looks like. You can see that there are some very drastic differences between both of these creatures. She also believed that the orang pendek became a bipedal creature after the eruption of the supervolcano known as Toba over 75,000 years ago. And this was likely some sort of survival evolutionary trait where the primate was forced to stand up more often in order to look out for danger. Then in 1999, a cast footprint was taken from one of these sightings and was then examined by a primate biologist named Dr. Davis from the University of Cambridge. He compared it to other primates in the area, and he said that it did not belong to anyone in particular. However, he did say that it looked like a combination of multiple existing creatures. It was likely a combination between a gibbon, orangutan, chimp, and human. All he could definitely say is that it definitely pointed in the direction of belonging to a large unknown primate. Surprisingly, hares have also been compared and tested that are said to belong to this unknown creature, and the conclusions have told us that it belongs to some sort of undocumented species of primate. Then there's this last piece of evidence I want to show you guys. It's a video that was taken in 2017. A guy was motorbiking in the muddy roads of Indonesia, and he caught something very strange on video. So take a look and let me know what you guys think. Our final cryptid for today is the Ogopogo, and if you are Canadian, you've probably heard of this one. It's basically our version of the Loch Ness Monster, and it lives in British Columbia. Located on the west coast of Canada in the lakes of Kelowna, BC, the story of the Ogopogo goes way beyond colonial times. Sightings were first reported by the natives on the land around the 1800s. So for those of you who have never heard of the Ogopogo, it's said to resemble a prehistoric creature, something similar to a plesiosaur roaming the depths of the Okanagan waters. One of the first reported sightings was in 1855 from a man named John McDougall, who was crossing the lake on his canoe with his horses tied to the back in tow. Apparently, the horses had done this with him multiple times. They were able to swim with him while they were crossing the lake. However, on this particular instance, something very scary happened. Something ended up latching onto the horses behind John and started dragging them underwater. Unfortunately, John had absolutely no choice but to cut the ropes and essentially let the horses drown because whatever was pulling the horses into the water was about to do the exact same thing to him and his canoe. After the incident, John had absolutely no explanation for what could have caused that to his horses, since the Okanagan waters are essentially a lake and there's not really supposed to be any sort of big creature down there. About 20 years later, there was another notable sighting from a woman named Susan Allison, who claimed to have seen quote-unquote a dinosaur in the lake. In the 1920s, the sightings were said to have really taken off, and the Ogopogo is actually what made Kelowna a household name. Dozens and dozens of people were coming forward saying that they had seen some sort of serpent-like creature in the water that measured upwards of 30 feet long. Others were able to get a better look at it, saying that the head was kind of like a blunt, round shape, and its body, whenever it would push out over the surface of the water, would kind of create a hump-like pattern before diving back into the water. Of course, as time has passed by and technology has improved, people have been coming forward with photographic evidence since the 80s, many of them showing similar things. Although it's hard to make out in a lot of these videos and photos, you can definitely see that there is something breaching the water, with the most famous photo coming from a man named Bill Stichuk. It was May 24th, 2015, when Bill was actually on the balcony of his condo in Kelowna overlooking the water when he saw something very odd. It was about 200 meters off of the shoreline when its head popped out of the water, and it ended up staying there for about a minute, turning its head, moving it around in different directions, almost as if it were just observing the area. Most recently, a couple living in Kelowna were out on the boat in October of 2022. Their names were Dale and Colleen. They were enjoying the day when they saw something very odd approaching their boat in the water. They stared at it and took a photo of it, not being able to make out exactly what it was, and I'll put a picture up here for you guys to see. Dale was able to rule out sturgeon or some sort of dead mammal, but other than that, he had no idea what he was looking at. All he knew was that the two things sticking out of the water were approximately 3 feet apart. So what could have this thing really been? When I look at the photo, it kind of looks to me like I'm looking at some sort of wolf head or some sort of mask or statue that was possibly tossed into the water. But at the same time, I kind of see an eye, but it's really hard to make out what this creature could possibly be. But let me know what you guys think. And so, of course, with every cryptid theory out there, there are many possible explanations that come along with it, and it's no different for the Ogopogo. Starting with the Native Americans and what they have to say. They seem to believe that the Ogopogo is actually the spirit of the lake, a story that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. It's said that the Native Americans who lived in the area at the time would make offerings to the spirit of the lake, which they believed to live in an underwater cave near Rattlesnake Island. This was done in order to allow the natives to cross the lake peacefully and to make sure that they were able to cross the lake successfully as well. Those who believe in science, though, will tell you that the Ogopogo is likely a large fish and possibly even a sturgeon. Although white sturgeon are indigenous to the lakes in British Columbia, there have not been any officially documented as living in the Okanagan Lake. At one point, the lake was connected to the Columbia River, which is known to have plenty of sturgeon, but in the 1920s, it was blocked off by a dam that was built. So essentially, there shouldn't be any sturgeon in the Okanagan Lake unless the sturgeon that are there have been living there for over 100 years, which is not impossible, just unlikely. Other people have also come forward and presented the idea that this is probably just some sort of abnormal or random rogue wave that people are seeing in the water, or even possibly some sort of floating log that is creating ripples in the water. But whatever it is, we just don't have the answers to that yet. So let me know what you guys think. Is the Ogopogo real, or is it just a figment of our imagination? Alright guys, that's gonna do it for today's video. Top 5 cryptids that could possibly be real and that are not Bigfoot. So if you guys enjoyed this video, please consider comment, like, subscribing. I would really appreciate it. And if you want more crime creepy content, check out my TikTok. The link is in my description box, and I will see you guys in the next video.